Welcome to Kali Tribune Pod. This episode will be inspired by a book named Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition by author Glenn Maggee. Now, this will of course not be the review of the book. It will not be based on the thesis that book puts forward, namely that Hegel was in line with the tradition of so-called Hermeticism or Hermetic tradition, but it is only inspired by it, by certain ideas that I will put forward to take this as a launching point for talking about Hegel and the spirit of modernity, a perennial bugbear here on Kali Tribune. So in order to give a kind of introduction into a subject which will be quite naughty, naughty with a K, not naughty, because everything concerning Hegel tends to go the complicated way at some point, and I think with a good reason, and Hegel is not to blame for this. And on the other hand, we'll talk about Hegel's relation to modernity, Hegel as premier modern metaphysician. Now, in order to do that, I will give some of the starting propositions, and some of them will be what I accept from the author of this book I just mentioned. Now, the thesis that Hegel's philosophy, so-called, or rather to be more precise and in line with Hegel's own utterances, Hegel's speculation, or Hegel's system of absolute knowledge, is based upon the idea that human and divine consciousness, and I use consciousness here advisedly because he's using this term, are identical in the final instance. In other words, that God needs man, or that God, as unlimited thinking or an unlimited mind, needs a human mind to exist. God does not reveal himself in Hegel's eyes because he wants to reveal himself, but primarily because he needs to reveal himself. He needs to embody himself, incorporate himself. This idea Glenn Maggee holds to be a Hermetic idea. He puts forward some very good arguments. He traces some of the Hegel's ideas to either to directly to some thinkers like Jacob Böhme, not strictly speaking Hermeticist, but kind of Baroque Gnostic. And this is the strongest historical argument Maggee has, by the way, because Böhme was supreme influence on Hegel, and Hegel is explicit about it. Problem with Hegel is that he is not really explicit about his main influences, I believe, together with Eric Vogelin, who also wrote, I think, in a superior manner to Maggee, about Hegel, and called him agnostic, not strictly Hermeticist. But Böhme is one of the influences that are really, really obvious in Hegel, as Hegel is talking about it, calls him Philosophus Teutonicus, and in fact the father of German philosophy. He considered him like that. It's quite interesting, because if you are a connoisseur of history of philosophy, you'll know that Hegel goes under the moniker absolute rationalist. Now, if you know anything about Jacob Böhme is prima donna of esotericists or occultists. His thinking is not a rational thinking in the sense of enlightenment, for sure. It is more like description of visions, thinking in symbols, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, Hegel thought that Böhme had a right form of what will become speculative system of absolute knowledge in his own time. Right form, but not right content, but maybe not the right form. He still struggled because he was historically earlier than Hegel. Never mind. So this is Maggee's thesis, and this thesis I accept it because it can be proven from Hegel himself, because Hegel is quite explicit about this. Spirit is spirit insofar it is a revealed spirit. That's, to paraphrase phenomenology disguised of Hegel. So this is what I accept. I will not call it Hermeticism. I will leave to you the pleasure of reading Maggee's book. That is, I think, free online in PDF format, so you can print it out. It's not a big book. It's not that well resourced, I'm afraid, but it's very good. It's very good incentive on thinking about Hegel. Only please don't, I beg, fledgling interpreters not to fall in the trap of taking it as a final word on Hegel, because conspiracy theorists, I saw some conspiracy theorists latch on it who never read Hegel himself to prove that Hegel is in part of some Kabbalistic Masonic conspiracy. You won't find proof for that. Hegel was never proven to be, for instance, a Freemason. He hung out with Freemasons, which was normal at the time, but used even their symbolism. But he was not one. He was a very conservative, very upright citizen of Berlin in the end of his later years, and he was not an occultist or something like that. But there are very strong aspects of this in him. And that's what we'll talk about. Now, first, to finish this introduction with a critique of something that Maggee said, that we will use as a differentiation point of what Hegel does and what traditional metaphysics does. Because the assumption behind this podcast is that Hegel is a modern metaphysician. This assumption is, I call it assumption for sake of the proper form, but it is true. It is not something you have to prove because Hegel is metaphysician, but his understanding of metaphysics is inversion in a way of traditional notion of metaphysics. What is peculiar and what is really interesting and important in Hegel, what makes him unavoidable benchmark of modernity, is that he indeed was metaphysician. Now, some guy like Herbert Spencer after Hegel in England or something like that is not a metaphysician. He is a modernist in the sense that he is the proponent of evolution, of moving from primitive towards less primitive, blah 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 blah. But those people, as well as in our day and age, the dominant ideological strains are technocratic and are mostly latching to technological advancement as a sign of modernity, and maybe in post-humanism they really go even towards the idea of technology completely amending human, transcending human. Problem with these currents, as frightening as they can be, as dominant as they are, because they are dominant. As Eric Vogelin once said, we are living in the age ruled by Gnostic heresies, and it really has a weight when somebody like Vogelin says this, because he was not an outsider. He was a naturalized American citizen that had a career in philosophy. He's not that famous, as famous as he should have be, but it really rings true, and it was said before the time of political correctness and such things, when this is really becoming explicit. But Hegel is peculiar in the sense that he's really profound. His metaphysics of modernity is profound, and its destructive core its destructive potential works from the inside out, not from the outside in, as somebody like posthumanist would do. And this is more dangerous, this is more sinister, if you please. This is more seductive, because you can maybe already tell, if you follow Kali Tribune with my critical remarks on Hegel, that there is a very strong mixture of affection and antipathy when I talk about him. And most philosophers, people who are really devoted to philosophy, who don't consider philosophy just a language game or some crap like that, are always ambivalent towards him, because there is a profound talent for philosophy in him. There are profound insights, but with very, very sinister turn. Maybe until the end of this podcast we'll give some explanation as to why this discrepancy. Now, what Maggee says about Hegel's influences, putting aside Jakob Böhme, the most important influence, or Württemberg pietism. Württemberg was Hegel's birthplace, and this pietist variety of Protestantism Maggee considers to be a good transmitter for Bohemian and Hermetic and Gnostic ideas. You won't go into that, but there are some medieval sources, or early Renaissance sources Maggee puts forward, one of them being Meister Eckhart, of which I will hold judgment, his influence on Hegel. The other being Nicholas of Cusa, and here Maggee gets it wrong, because he takes Nicholas of Cusa's book De Visione Dei, about which I had something to say already a few years ago. You can find it among the videos. It's a kind of lecture, it's not article, where Maggee claims that, if I understand him correctly, Cusa advocated for this idea that since the visione Dei is both subjectivus objectivus and genitive objectivus and genitive subjectivus, that is to say that vision of God, this title of the book means God's vision and man's vision of God, that there is this hermetic idea of kind of dialectics between finite and infinite being, and where one needs another. There is no such thing in Nicholas of Cusa's. I won't go into explaining what Divisione Dei is. I'll only refer that I've already talked about it, and recommend that you look into it, because this small book is a really very interesting treatise of, that is to say, even exercise in mystical theology, as Nicholas calls it. There is no double bind. So for Nicholas of Cusa, our seeing of God, by seeing is his symbol for knowledge, is God's seeing of us, not the other way around. Infinite gaze of God is something we can participate in, we cannot identify with it. So to know God in his essence, I would dare to say, would be rather being known by God, where God gives you, uplifts you, and gives you a portion, a participatory act of his own act. But you are absolutely dependent on him, not the other way around, as if God would exist truly only if he would have a mirror as a human intellect or human soul. This is not the case of Nicholas of Cusa's, and if I understood Maggee rightly, if this is what he claims, he's wrong. There is no, I think, not a single quotation of Nicholas of Cusa in Hegel, but never mind that. There are almost no quotations of Meister Eckhart, but this doesn't mean that those ideas are not present. Eckhart is surely present, and in great philosophers, mostly the most important things are unspoken directly, are expressed in the form of their philosophy, and this is the case with Hegel too. But this idea, this is what I wanted to say, an interpretation of Nicholas of Cusa's is wrong, and this is very important for us subjects, because this is the alienation between traditional let's rather say theology than metaphysics, and modern metaphysics or modern theology. Because for Hegel, Sophia of his system, his speculative thought, is theology. That is to say, philosophy and theology are identical. He's very explicit about it, and this is not the case in tradition. This is something very different. So, when we have done with that, let's see what are Hegel's main tenets. Now, Hegel believes that he lives in a time where philosophy can leave philein behind. That is to say, it has to cease to be a love towards wisdom. That is to say, craving, intentional pursuit of truth and being, and instead become possession thereof. It has to become Sophia. This is from his introduction of Phenomenologie des Geists, one of his early and more difficult works, where most of the real profundities of his philosophy are to be found, but be warned, trying to read it is not for the faint of heart. It's very difficult book. This means that Hegel is, strictly speaking, agnostic. No, not agnostic, but gnostic, the gnostic. That is to say, he is craving true knowledge. He is not craving merciful participation in God's gaze, as Nicholas of Cusa would propose. He is seeking identity with it. And I think this is something that is incontestable when we talk about Hegel. Now, Glenn Maggee believes that there is a hermetic idea behind this, and goes on a long tangents about Jakob Böhme. Now, we'll say something about Böhme, just to give you an illustration what this means. Böhme, in his 17th century, he lived in 17th century in Görlitz, that is, I think now in Poland, or that was on Polish-German border, a little small city was. Look him up. I'll try to provide some links. There is one very good lecture on Böhme by Walter Hanegraaff of Amsterdam, so I'll give a link for those who are interested. Böhme was a kind of gnostic that was giving not theodicy, the kind of justification of God, but rather a cosmodicy, a justification of the world. What this means? Well, if you want to prove God's existence and explore God's essence, which is really a travesty of modern metaphysics, that they really try to do this, from like Leibniz and such. In somebody like Böhme, there is an attempt to justify God's existence in accordance to the criteria of the world, and this criteria is mostly the existence of evil. How to account for existence of evil? I think this is what I speculate was Böhme's motive, because he couldn't find this answer. He was a Protestant. He was called to stand alone before the God face to face, and well, interesting things happened. Böhme's idea is that evil has a reason to exist, but in the sense that it is the constituent part or constituent phase in the ontological, theological, theogonical process of the birth of God. Therefore, Böhme talks about God, about essential core, as a core of his philosophy. He's talking of God as he comes to pass in eternity. Now, this is something I cannot stress this hard enough. People think that there is some ancient, that people like Böhme are going into some ancient source of knowledge. This is very modern. This is not something that I think any of the church fathers did. maybe less balanced, if I may say so, like Clement of Alexandria and some of these really, Origen, these early Alexandrian theologians would maybe get some ideas in this sense, but it was mostly alien to the mind of antiquity and Middle Ages concerning monotheist religion. I'm not talking about theogonies of Hesiod or Olympian gods, but strictly when it comes to Christianity and Hebrew tradition that is incorporated in it. This is something you don't do. Of course, there is a Kabbalah, of which Maggee also speaks, and that probably influenced Böhme and Hegel. We won't go into that, but this is still not proven to be ancient tradition. Same like Hermeticism. I'm not an expert, but I know this. Mostly consensus now is that Corpus Hermeticum is a late antiquity corpus. It is not something that comes from the time out of mind. It's a rather late comer on the historical scene. But what I want to extract here from Böhme as one of those premier influences on Hegel, Maggee wants to point out, is this crucial place reserved for evil, and the idea that you can justify evil in a sense from the act of God, moreover from the very act of birth of God. And this is something that I think Maggee is right when he says that Hegel does the same thing as Böhme. He just does it in a different manner. Now, Hegel's idea of his historical place was that he is in the unique situation at the birth of modernity, at the aftermath of Protestant Reformation and French Revolution, which are two premier events that make things possible for him. He is very explicit about it, where tradition finally comes to fruition. To wit, Hegel believed that modernity is the explication and realization of all ages. And this, my friends, is the epitome of modern delusion. Hegel goes further from all. No Kurzweil, post-humanist, or Max More can match him with this, because they are superficial know-nothings intellectually. Hegel is a profound German philosopher, man brought in the profoundly subtle culture with extreme breadth of knowledge. And as such, he's deadly dangerous. Hegel's system was called by Prussian court at the time when they realized the consequences in a revolutionary movement that were inspired by Hegel. It was called dragon seed. Dragon seed from the myth of Argonauts and of Medea's father, who sowed the teeth of the dragon in the mounds, in the furrows, and then they there grow up from earth grow up some kind of bronze warriors that he had to kill, and he did it as if I recall correctly each day, and so on and so forth. So then a dragon seed, you sow the teeth of dragon, and then you get the army that goes to destroy you. Dragon seed, to be more precise, dragon seed of Hegel's panlogism. That's the full phrase. And then they called his former friend Schelling to counter his influence, and so on and so forth, but that's a story in itself. Now I just want to stress how important he is, because there is no communism without Hegel. I mean, Marxism is an inversion of Hegelian philosophy, and it will be very unjust towards Hegel, as I see on internet. Some of these internet-based, obviously internet-educated American commentators do to quote this Hegelian or Hegel's philosophy with Marxism as a kind of necessary development from Hegel. It's not really like that. It's different spirit completely. But Hegel bears a huge responsibility for some ills of the 20th century. I would say he does, but we have to be precise about that. Now, why this insistence of evil? Well, it is a very peculiar thing when you consider, when you study philosophy. You notice that after some time, in Greek philosophy, in medieval philosophy, in patristic, there is a very little, when it comes to metaphysics, there is a very little treatment of the problem of evil. That is to say, evil is not so much treated as problem. Of course, it is present. You have it, for instance, in Plotinus, in Neoplatonism, true Neoplatonism. You have Plotinus' Ennead essay, Ennead treatise dedicated on evil, to evil and to matter, and so on and so forth. Moderns, as a rule, find this treatment unsatisfying. Hegel was, for instance, explicit about it, because Hegel is a spokesman of our age. If we are to accept that modernity still exists, I'm not really so sure, but okay. Because he was talking about it, that profound question of evil was never satisfactorily answered. Now, why think this? Is it because it was not satisfactorily answered, or maybe it was satisfactorily answered, but we want something more? And I think the second alternative is true. For Jacob Böhme, Lucifer is a necessity, but not necessity that looked from the historical point of view. Once he fell, now it's necessary that this and this and this happen. No. His necessity to fulfill not God's plan, not God's acts, not God's wishes, but God's essence. He is the negative part of that essence for Böhme. And this is something that Hegel picks up also. Although, it's a very peculiar thing in Hegel is that the word Teufel, devil, I think never to be encountered in his books, in his lectures, and so on. It's very interesting, only maybe in context of him quoting Goethe's Faustus. Whereas in Böhme, in Hegel, evil is a special kind of negativity that is essential for all. So in both thinkers, we are talking about birth of God. That assumes the ability to know the essence of God, because to know the essence is to know the cause. To know the cause is to know the origin. This is a huge no-no in medieval and antique predecessors of people like Hegel and Jacob Böhme. This is a no-go zone, let's call it that. Because this assumes that you are, and rightly so, identifying with the object of your knowledge, object in inverted commas, because nobody in medieval ages would call God object of anything. This means to know that what Nicholas of Cusa would say should be inverted, in a sense that there should be equivalency between God and man. That God's essence can be known by man only insofar as there is a convertibility between God and man, because a like knows the like. This is the old principle of antiquity that these men accepted, but used it in a sense that nobody in antiquity, as far as I know, save maybe Gnostics, but you're never sure what Gnostics taught because they are so confusing, Nobody would use something like this. And so, to conclude this first episode of our podcast, because there must be more episodes we will cover. Maybe we'll try to stretch this even to 3 episodes, because I'll talk about things that go after Hegel and his influence and our own age, because the most relevant is for us is to see how we are now formed by the problems that were created 200 years ago. The essence is that knowledge can be absolute, that this absolute knowledge is convertible with God's knowledge, that human essence is convertible with God's essence, and that evil is the necessary constituent of good, of absolute good. Without evil, there is no good. Without darkness, there is no light. What I want to stress in this phase is that this is completely and absolutely counter-traditional. This is something that you will not find. You will find debate. You will find this Summa contra gentiles Thomas Aquinsky really addressing these problems, but not because he considers them relevant, but because there were heretics who came with something like this. So he tries to answer that God's perfection cannot be compromised and so on. And by the way, I'll conclude with this, with premier modern thinker of 20th century, Carl Gustav Jung, who said at one place, I don't remember where, but I remember vividly when he wrote that to say that Holocaust, the Holocaust was not used, that the destructions of mass of concentration camps of Second World War and gulags. So probably those were 50s when he wrote that. If he was still alive, then I don't know. Cannot be to account for them with the term privatio boni, that means lack of good. This is the medieval definition of evil, is an insult. And I remember thinking to myself, why? As if in 13th century, I don't know, Albert the Great or Thomas Aquinas didn't know evil. I mean, in an age where probably child mortality was about 19%, 80% for nobility. They were noblemen, but they were noblemen that devoted their life to extreme poverty. They were Dominicans. I mean, those early Dominicans were very strict about this. That they didn't know what evil is. That mass murder, the sacking of cities, the plagues. I mean, this is before the Great Black Plague, but pestilencia, any kind of these epidemics, they tended to call it what we now call plague. They didn't know this. Like hell they didn't. They knew better. They knew better, because this mass evil of 20th century, you can say that it's greater evil, but it's greater in a sense that it is made possible by modernity, both ideologically, technologically, and it's made possible because also because you cannot wrap your minds around numbers. People can think of this in terms of numbers, not in really encountering what happened. In Middle Ages, the violence and death were at your doorstep and beyond it, and inside your house, everywhere. If it happened, you knew it happened. In 20th century, not so. You could be isolated from all this, what I want to say, and pass the moral judgments and so on and so forth. This is very peculiar thing, and this is something we'll talk about in the very end when we'll talk about the profound effect of modern metaphysics that is exemplified in Hegel. And Jung, who is hardly a Hegelian, is very Hegelian here in his thinking, because he's modern, he's a modernist, modern man. What was conscious for middle-aged men is unconscious for him. He inverts things. There are only few and far in between great thinkers like Erik Vogelin, like René Guénon, who were aware of this. but we'll point out those contrasts, and we'll talk about it in our final passages, final words of this series of podcasts. In the second podcast, we'll go about laying out the Hegel's system of absolute knowledge, or Hegel's speculation, as he calls it. Not strictly dialectic speculatio for him, or mirroring. Literary is a method of philosophy, of Sophia, is a method of absolute knowledge and creation of absolute system of knowledge. Mirroring of finite and infinite. You can already guess that this has a lot to do with this identification, or better to say, putting man and God in this dialectical relationship of mutual dependence, and furthermore putting evil in a dialectical relation of dependence with good. So thank you for your attention. I will do my best to have the next episode ready the following week.